The year 1946 brought judgment at Nuremberg for the major Nazi war criminals such as Rudolf Hess, Wilhelm Keitel, and Hermann Goering. Meanwhile, survivors of the Holocaust flooded to Palestine, demanding their own state from the British. In India, too, the British Empire was under pressure, as Mahatma Gandhi led the demand for independence. On a happier note, the Queen Elizabeth restarted passenger trips to New York. Another famous visitor to America, Winston Churchill, warned the world that an Iron Curtain had descended across Europe. And on Thursday, the 2nd of May, people lined the shores as gunfire was heard across San Francisco Bay. It came from the notorious island prison of Alcatraz. The warden had sent a telegram to all media. It read, "Serious trouble. Convict has machine gun in cell house. Have issued riot call and placed armed guards at strategic locations." The report made sensational headlines. The warden went on to advise that many of our officers are imprisoned in the cell house. As the day went on, local radio station KGOP added to the hysteria, reporting that rampaging convicts have stormed and captured the prison arsenal. Prison officers have been slaughtered. Armed prisoners are overrunning the island. Women and children, families of prison employees are in desperate peril. The warden has sent out a call for help to all military and police agencies. A desperate emergency confronts everyone in the San Francisco Bay Area. As it turned out, this was an exaggeration, but before the emergency was over, 80 Marines in full combat order had landed on the island. Bombs and gas were exploded over the prison, 2 guards and 3 prisoners had been killed, and 15 men were injured. It was the most dangerous attempted escape in the checkered history of the supposedly escape-proof prison, and one which damaged both its buildings and its reputation. Alcatraz means Island of the Pelicans, a name given by Spanish explorers in 1775 when the big-beaked birds covered the island. It became a military fort and then a jail for Confederate prisoners during the Civil War. As this photograph from about 1865 shows, the island and its garrison were heavily armed. The warders brought their families to live with them. Later, the island housed the most troublesome Indian chiefs and Spanish troops captured in the Philippines. During the First World War, deserters and German spies were shut up there. But during the 1920s, its buildings fell gradually into ruins. Then in 1933, it was decided that a secure federal prison was needed. Attorney General Homer S. Cummings announced a new role for Alcatraz.
Let the underworld take heed of these convictions as proof of the grim fact that a criminal career leads inevitably to prison.
These side-by-side headlines showed clearly the need for an escape-proof prison. John Dillinger's rescue making a mockery of existing jails. The early 30s were a lawless time in America. Cities were ruled by gangster bosses with private armies, ruthless and ready to kill. In rural areas, many out-of-work farm boys turned to crime. Some robbed banks, and a lot of law-abiding citizens had been so hurt by the Depression that they secretly cheered on the bandits, tormenting the businessmen who had foreclosed on them. The newspapers and radio bulletins were full of crime. Hardly a day went by without some violent killing. While those who crossed them died, the most notorious gang leaders seemed to have a charmed life, openly running the major cities without retribution from the lawmen, who were all too often prepared to look the other way in return for bribes and favors. And when the forces of law and order did close in, the crooks were often able to shoot their way out. Even when they were jailed, too many of them escaped with the ease of Houdinis. The structure of the underworld was the result of supplying liquor during the 14 years of Prohibition, from early 1920 to late 1933. Despite the ban on alcohol, America drank at least 100 million gallons of bootleg booze every year. A lot of it came in by sea. The gang wars between rival suppliers were vicious and bloody. In Chicago alone, at least 1,000 men died. While the US Coast Guards stopped thousands of boats bringing in bootleg liquor, many hundreds of thousands of journeys were made by ships and boats bringing supplies from Canada, the Caribbean, and elsewhere. With the repeal of Prohibition, bootlegging did not cease. Avoiding alcohol taxes was, and still is, a lucrative way of making money. The authorities did what they could to stop the trade by destroying the barrels and bottles they found. But as Prohibition ended, the men at the top were also moving into an even more lucrative area of smuggling: drugs. Heroin alone made them an annual profit of $2.5 billion. The authorities tried to take advantage of the conflict between rival gangs. If they couldn't hijack their competitors' supplies, gangsters would frequently betray their whereabouts to the authorities. The public's attitude was ambivalent. They liked booze, and they rather admired the outlaws. So when John Dillinger was shot in this alley, coming out of the movies, the crowds that came to stare were sorry to see the end of such a colorful character. Similarly, they were not nearly as upset as the authorities would have liked by the success of Al Capone, his riches, his women, and his apparent omnipotence. All this adulation of bootleggers and criminals deeply upset J. Edgar Hoover, head of the FBI. In 1933, he declared war on men he called public enemies. As part of this war, he wanted the publicity coup of setting up a really tough prison for the country's worst criminals. When the former military prison on Alcatraz was suggested, he put all his support behind turning it into the world's harshest prison. The defenses of the island were modernized to prepare for the arrival of America's most dangerous criminals. And on the 14th of August, 1934, the first 53 hard cases were sent from Atlanta Penitentiary in what was called the Atlanta Boys Convoy. They were herded onto a special train and chained to their seats. Its windows had steel bars and close mesh wire. The carriages were rolled onto a special boat to take them across the bay. Among its infamous passengers was Al Capone. As these pictures show, prison had so far meant little hardship for Capone. He had been able to use his power to buy all sorts of luxury and privilege, but the journey to Alcatraz was a journey to another world, where there were to be no special favors for anyone. On Alcatraz, the crime boss became anonymous prisoner number 85. He was given the same sort of Spartan cell as everyone else. He asked for special visiting rights, but was turned down. He was put to work cleaning up the bathhouse and became known as the Wop with the Mop. He was disliked by the other prisoners, and in June 1935, bank robber Jim Lucas crept up behind him and stabbed him with scissors. He spent a week in hospital. Capone became an excellent cobbler, but he was released after 5 years on Alcatraz to die at home from syphilis. The excitement and publicity surrounding Machine Gun Kelly's transfer to the island shows the importance which Hoover and the FBI attached to building up Alcatraz's reputation as the last home of America's worst criminals. In reality, Kelly never fired any kind of gun in anger in his life, and was known to be, as one reporter put it, a good-natured slob, a bootlegger who spilled more than he delivered. Arrested for a bungled kidnapping, Kelly's misfortune was to be saddled with his flamboyant nickname, which made him a natural guest of the Rock. Uncooperatively, he behaved so well there that he was sent back to a mainland prison where he died of a heart attack. Other notorious prisoners included Alvin "Creepy" Karpis. He became the longest-serving prisoner on the Rock, serving almost 30 years there. He had been part of the Barker gang and was joined by the deadliest of Ma Barker's bank-robbing sons, Arthur, better known as Doc, who enjoyed killing, with or without provocation. Robert Stroud, misnamed the Birdman of Alcatraz, had 3 convictions for murder. In Leavenworth, he had written books on bird diseases. Altogether, he spent 56 years behind bars, nearly all in solitary confinement. But at Alcatraz, he wasn't allowed by Warden James Johnston to keep birds or to continue his studies. For Johnston, the first warden of Alcatraz from 1934 to 1948, initiated a merciless regime. Prisoners were not allowed to speak to each other in the cell house or mess hall. A single whisper would bring a guard's gas stick down on a prisoner. He could then be taken to the dungeon holes to eat just 4 slices of bread a day and sleep on the concrete floor. The cells themselves were only about 6 foot by 9 foot, and prisoners spent 14 hours a day locked in them. Knives were banned from the mess hall in case convicts stole and sharpened them. The food, however, was surprisingly good, but every scrap had to be eaten. Saltwater Johnston, as the convicts called him, banned newspapers and radios. In the library, only uplifting books were allowed. Other punishments which the guards could use included hosing with icy water and loss of the coveted good time, by which 1/3 of a sentence could be lopped off for good behavior. Prisoners were put to work doing laundry for nearby Navy and Army bases. There was also a shoe repair shop and furniture, clothing and brush factories. Prisoners could only mix in the exercise yard for less than an hour a day. They could have only one visitor for 2 hours per month, and they were kept separated by shatterproof glass. Conversation was by telephone and was heavily censored. The towers were permanently manned by guards with 2 guns, a carbine for close shots and a high-powered rifle in case a convict did manage to launch himself on some crude craft into the surrounding water. There was one warder for every 3 inmates, costing the taxpayer twice as much to keep a convict on Alcatraz as any other federal prison. But strangely enough, among the supplies ferried regularly to the Rock were 3 packs of cigarettes a week for every inmate. This was because Warden Johnston decided to prevent tobacco, the usual prison currency, from becoming the money substitute there. Instead, the men gambled with push-ups. The harsh regime encouraged many prisoners to take on the almost impossible odds and attempt to escape. The first man to try was Joe Bowers, who climbed a wire fence on the 27th of April, 1936. But he was picked off by a sharpshooting guard. His head shattered, he tumbled down into the sea. The next attempt came one foggy night in December 1937. Theodore Sonny Boy Cole and Ralph Rowe had the job of disposing of excess rubber from the mat factory. They threw it all in the same spot under the cliffs so that they could jump safely onto it and then use the rubber to buoy a raft made of petrol cans to get across the dangerous currents which swept round the island. Police on the mainland were issued with photographs of the pair, but nobody ever saw either Ralph Rowe or Ted Cole again. They were written off as drowning in the turbulent, freezing, current-twisted waters of the bay. But every prisoner on the Rock hoped that they had managed to escape, and Alvin Karpis sent the warden a mocking Christmas card every year, signed Ted and Ralph. The next attempt was in May 1938 by kidnapper Tom Limerick and Jim Lucas, the man who had stabbed Al Capone. They murdered a guard with a hammer, but found themselves locked out on the roof of the prison. Limerick, shot in the eye, fell to his death. Lucas received an extra sentence of life. Doc Barker was the next one to try. In January 1939, he and 4 others managed to saw their way out of their cells. Barker ran to the water's edge, but there he was shot dead. In April 1943, Floyd Hamilton, brother of Raymond Hamilton, Bonnie and Clyde's associate, led 3 other prisoners who overpowered a guard, but none got far from the shore. Then, in 1946, came the celebrated Battle of the Rock, as this contemporary newsreel reports.
As Alcatraz guards are overcome by such vicious criminals as Bernard Paul Coy with a lengthy prison record, Joseph Paul Kretzer facing a life term as a cold-blooded killer, and Marvin Franklin Hubbard, kidnapper. Coy and his crew of desperados fought furiously with guards and Marines. Balked in their attempted escape by the heroism of a guard who refused to surrender the main key, the barricaded convicts carried on a pitched battle which raged for 2 days and nights. Grenades found their mark, and fires flared in the prison grounds. With the 3 ringleaders dead in their foxhole, Federal Prison Director Bennett and Warden Johnston, wearing glasses, count the cost. In addition to the dead convicts, 2 prison guards lost their lives. 15 wounded men completed the casualty list, Assistant Warden Edward Miller being one. 3 other convicts may pay the death penalty for their part in the grim Battle of the Rock.
An official inquiry established what had really happened. The Battle of Alcatraz began at 1:45 p.m. on the 2nd of May, when a prisoner who had been working in the kitchen in the block in the center of this picture was returning to the main cell block on the right. Only one guard, William Miller, was on the floor of the cell block, and as he went to let in Marvin Hubbard, the notorious gunman, he was slugged from behind by Bernard Coy, who was being moved from his cell. Miller was beaten up and placed in a cell, while the 2 prisoners then released several accomplices, including Clarence Carnes, who had a record of murder, kidnapping, assault, and escapes, and Joseph Kretzer, who was notorious as a ruthless and cold-blooded killer. Coy then climbed up the bars to the gun gallery, which dominated the cell block. There was only one guard on duty there, and Coy was able to overpower him. He took his revolver and Springfield rifle and used these to force the unarmed officer who was on duty in cell block D to let him in. There he released 12 men who had been in solitary confinement. The prisoner's plan was to get across the recreation yard, go down the steps to the landing area, seize the prison launch, and speed across the bay to waiting cars. But Miller had hidden a vital key which would have let them into the yard, and they jammed the lock, attempting to open it with other keys they had found. Meanwhile, reserve officers had been alerted when Miller failed to answer a routine call. They left the administration block, but were intercepted by armed prisoners, and 9 were locked in cell 403. The alarm was now raised, with the prisoners isolated in the cell block and the guards imprisoned in this cell. Kretzer and another freed prisoner, Sam Shockley, started beating them up, and then Kretzer shot at them. He thought he had killed them all, but 7 survived, and one was able to scribble the names of the ringleaders on the wall of the cell. Coy was furious when he thought that Kretzer had destroyed their trump card, hostages. A triangular shootout followed, as Coy and Kretzer stalked each other, and military reinforcements surrounded the cell block as night fell. By the next morning, crowds filled every vantage point. All available prison officers had been backed up with 80 Marines, and the remaining prisoners were taken from their cells and put in the recreation yard. There they were guarded by the Marines, while officers now began their assault on the cell block. Constant fire was maintained on it. Officers got on the roof to dig holes through which grenades were dropped. Others broke windows to throw in smoke bombs. A pall of smoke rose over the prison as the Marines fired bazookas and mortars. At last, 41 hours after the revolt began, the cell block was finally stormed and the surviving guards released. Kretzer, Coy, and Hubbard were found dead, and the 3 remaining killers were brought to trial. Thompson and Shockley were executed, and 19-year-old Carnes, in the center of this picture, got an additional life sentence. Perhaps the only escape attempt to succeed came in June 1962. 3 bank robbers gouged out their cell ventilators to make holes large enough to climb through. The authorities said they used spoons, stolen from the mess hall, as tools. Frank Morris and the brothers John and Clarence Anglin had prepared thoroughly. Morris was the mastermind and obtained plaster of Paris, a woman's makeup kit, and hair from the barber shop. The 3 men then used these to make dummies, which they placed in their beds to fool the guards. During the night, the guards' flashlights shone on apparently sleeping prisoners. In fact, this painted cardboard hid a hole through which they had all squeezed. It wasn't until morning that their ruse was discovered. By then, they had clambered up these drain pipes and slipped through a skylight onto the roof. From there, they climbed down an unguarded wall and ran to the sea. To get across the bay, they had planned to inflate rubber raincoats as rafts. All searches failed, and the authorities are said to have hushed up finding some of the prisoners' effects on Angel Island, their planned staging post across the bay. The last and physically most impressive escape came on the 16th of December 1962. Bank robbers John Paul Scott and Darl Lee Parker slipped through bars of a kitchen window, which they had weakened with string and scouring powder. Parker only got as far as a small group of rocks about 100 yards away, but Scott reached the shore before collapsing with exhaustion and being recaptured. It was ironic that this near success came only months before officials made an historic announcement. Alcatraz prison was to be closed. Journalists arrived to hear Warden Owen Blackwell announce that its crumbling structure had been weakened by the explosions it had endured in the siege. It would have needed at least $5 million to repair. So, on the 15th of May, 1963, the last 27 prisoners left the island to the feathered successors of the Pelicans and the gaze of tourists. The island became an essential part of every VIP's tour of San Francisco. Nikita Khrushchev arrived a few months after it closed. He was followed by Charles de Gaulle. Ordinary tourists could catch a boat to the island from Pier 43. In 1969, 800 Native Americans illegally occupied the island for 18 months. The group, which said it was protesting against white oppression, claimed that a treaty in 1868 allowed Indians to take possession of all unoccupied federal land. They were finally evicted by an armed government force without serious bloodshed. Today, the dreaded prison island of Alcatraz has become just one more stop on the San Francisco tourist beat. One of the most popular sights is the dummy head, which sent an unsuspecting guard into hysterics because he thought Frank Morris had been decapitated.
This is where they widen the ventilator.
The hole which Morris hollowed out and squeezed through has been left as it was. Cell 42, used by Robert Stroud, the so-called Birdman of Alcatraz, is another showpiece. This is how filmgoers think of Robert Stroud as portrayed by Burt Lancaster, but in reality, Stroud was never able to keep any birds. Liquor is now readily available on Alcatraz if you put on a party, and one wonders what the ghosts of the men who lived on bread and water would make of these festivities. For despite the merriment, it's hard to look across San Francisco Bay without suppressing a small shiver for the lost souls who lived and died within the grim walls of the island of Alcatraz.